Hello! We invite you on an exciting journey through the history of humanity, from the very first primitive battles to the most modern and unexpected forms of conflict yet to come. This is not just a story about wars and victories. It is a story about how people have changed, about their dreams, fears, and hopes in the most challenging moments. You will discover how wars have brought not only destruction, but also new ideas, breakthroughs, and changes that shaped entire generations. The seeds of conflict, competition in the natural world. Since the dawn of life, conflict has been woven into the fabric of existence. Long before the first stone was sharpened into a weapon, even before the first ancient ancestor of humankind stood upright, the struggle for resources, mates, and space drove evolutionary changes across the animal kingdom. The origins of war. If we broaden our understanding beyond armies and borders, lie in the primal competition that defines the natural world. Life and rivalry. At the micro level. At the level of microbes, competition is relentless and unforgiving. Colonies of bacteria compete for dominance on a petri dish, each using their chemical arsenal to suppress, kill, or outgrow their rivals. Some produce antibiotics to inhibit the growth of others. Others mutate to develop resistance, sparking endless invisible arms races. Even in the bacterial world, total war is not an overstatement. Within these microscopic battles are the earliest shadows of later, more complex behaviors. Survival is not guaranteed by strength alone, but by adaptation, resistance, and the capacity to outmaneuver competitors. These primitive contests, repeated countless times every second across the biosphere, form the very foundation of life's diversity. Ants and the dawn of social warfare. Scaling up, one finds some of the most astonishing examples of organized conflict among the insects. Among all, ants exhibit a striking parallel to human warfare. A single anthill can support tens of thousands, sometimes millions of workers, soldiers, and a queen. Their conflicts with rival colonies are dramatic and brutal. Forays are launched across disputed territory, scouts are captured and torn apart, and chemical signals coordinate mass assaults. Some ant species are even known to raid neighboring nests, carry off larvae as prisoners, or brainwash the young into serving their own colony. Ant warfare lacks any notion of mercy or negotiation. Each side fights until the other is destroyed, absorbed, or driven away. It is a world governed by instinct, directed by genetics, and honed by natural selection. Ants remind us that organized violence is not an exclusively human innovation. It is an ancient strategy with deep evolutionary roots. Mammals, hierarchies, and advanced competition. Among mammals, the landscape of conflict is more varied and at times more nuanced. In herds of hoofed animals, dominance is often established through ritual displays or sparring, with fatal outcomes being rare. However, the stakes are real. Control over mating opportunities, access to nurturing grounds, and status within the group. Pack predators, such as wolves or African wild dogs, must balance aggression with cooperation. Their social life demands an intricate etiquette of submission, alliance, and leadership. Fighting is most intense when packs compete for territory or when dominant animals are challenged. The cost of such skirmishes is high, and evolution favors those packs and individuals capable of negotiating subtle balances of power. Primates, the seeds of human-like warfare. The primates, our own extended family within the tree of life, offer the closest analogs to early human conflict. While competition for status, resources, and mates is seen in nearly every group, apes stand apart in their complexity. Baboon society, for example, is rigidly hierarchical. Intimidation and force are daily realities, and males often bear scars from violent encounters. Remarkably, the greatest cause of death among male baboons is not predation, but infighting, testament to the violent nature of their social order. Chimpanzees take this to the next level, displaying not only hierarchy within the troop, but organized, strategic violence directed outward. Over decades of observation, primatologists have recorded chimpanzee groups launching coordinated raids on neighboring communities. These raids are shockingly human-like in their method. Small bands of males move silently, pick off isolated rivals, and retreat quickly. Sometimes they defeat rival groups entirely and annex new territory. Instances of cannibalism and infanticide are rare, but instructive, showing how even the closest animal relatives to humans are capable of deliberate, organized aggression. Conversely, bonobos, another species of chimpanzee, rely on affiliation, social grooming, and sexual behaviors to resolve tensions. Fights are rare, and the group's stress is diffused through bonding and intimacy, not violence. Studying these two species side by side, scientists see the possibility of vastly different strategies for resolving the same evolutionary pressures. Cooperation and conflict. Two sides of the same coin. From bacteria to primates, the struggle for existence is not merely a matter of violence. It is equally built on cooperation. Ant colonies, wolf packs, baboon troops all survive through intricate social strategies. Kin selection and reciprocal altruism balance the harsher aspects of competition. It is not always the most brutal group who wins control of resources, but often the most coordinated, the most disciplined, and the most cohesive. This dialectic between cooperation and conflict, generosity and aggression, would set the stage for everything that followed in hominid and eventually in human society. Echoes in human nature. Though humans pride themselves on reason, morality, and invention, these traits did not erase our evolutionary inheritance. Instead, they reshaped it. The earliest conflicts among our ancestors were forged in the fires of animal competition, colored by the needs of survival, procreation, and group unity. From the microcosm of bacteria to the complex societies of primates, the history of life is filled with strife and struggle. And as readers will see, the human story of war will transform but never fully escape its origins in the ancient, bloody ballet of nature. From packs to tribes, the roots of human war. The first light of humanity's dawn brought no promises of peace. Our earliest ancestors, standing upright on the ancient landscapes of Africa, carried within them the same primal drives as their animal kin to outlast, to claim, to protect. As hominins began to diverge from their primate relatives, the nature of conflict and its expressions began to change in profound and uniquely human ways. At the core of this transformation lay the evolutionary demands of social living. No longer could an individual survive, much less thrive, as a solitary creature. The challenges of the environment, predators, harsh climate, competition for food necessitated cooperation. And so, with fragile beginnings, human tribes emerged, woven together by ties of kinship and mutual need. Yet paradoxically, these same bonds that fostered trust and loyalty within a group built invisible barriers against outsiders. The earliest tribes were, in effect, extended families, bands of 20, 30, perhaps 40 individuals, each member intimately known. Within these small units, disputes could be settled, at least in theory, through negotiation, ritual, or the peacemaking efforts of elders. But the world outside the campfire's circle burned with uncertainty. Strangers carried both allure and danger, a possible alliance, or a fatal threat. The default was fear, suspicion, and, if circumstances demanded, violence. Archaeological evidence suggests that even in the lower Paleolithic, violence was an inescapable part of life. Healed fractures, embedded projectile points, and blunt trauma on ancient skulls hint at confrontations not with wild beasts, but with other humans. In close quarters, with resources often in short supply, the temptation to resolve disagreements through force must have been omnipresent. But these confrontations were not the large-scale, organized wars of later millennia. Instead, they were small, personal, and often opportunistic revenge for theft, reprisal for the loss of a member, the taking of a mate. The dynamics mirrored those found among our closest primate relatives. The lines between battle and personal vendetta blurred. Yet, as tool use advanced and language began to blossom, something fundamentally different emerged within the human mind: the capacity for abstraction, storytelling, and shared identity. Myths were born, not merely as entertainment but as foundations of group cohesion. Stories about ancestors who defended the valley, who avenged a wrong, who sacrificed for their kin, welded individuals together into a nascent people. With this subtle shift, the seeds of collective conflict took root. As groups developed specialized tools, sharper spears, thrown stones, eventually simple projectiles like the atlatl, the potential for violence increased. Encounters with outsiders could turn deadly on a larger scale. Instead of a single blow with a club, an entire volley of missiles could rain on a rival band crossing into forbidden terrain. Defensive ditches and primitive barricades made their first appearance in sites tens of thousands of years old. Where once a fight meant two adversaries grappling hand-to-hand, now entire bands formed impromptu lines, primitive but organized. As the Pleistocene progressed and the human population swelled, so too did the scale and frequency of these encounters. Nomadic bands competing for the same watering holes or hunting grounds clashed regularly. Each conflict re-inscribed the memory of danger into collective consciousness. Beware the other, arm for defense, strike if threatened. Children learned as soon as they could walk that not all faces were friendly. Fear became a teacher and a shield. But conflict was never the only lesson handed down. As tribes grew in complexity, so did their systems of peacemaking and law. The role of the shaman, chieftain, or council of elders became crucial, negotiating truces, overseeing marriage alliances, mediating disputes before they erupted into bloodshed. These early political structures were shock absorbers, softening the impact of individual aggression, but never quite eliminating the threat that lay beyond the familiar. Still, cycles of violence persisted. Rivalry over mates, suspicion of witchcraft, encroachment on sacred lands, each could ignite deadly hostilities. Sometimes, vengeance spiraled for generations, creating lines of kin bound by the duty of retribution, who waited only for the right moment to strike. These blood feuds, recorded in both oral tradition and the bones of the dead, bound families together in a new kind of social contract, one written in memory, honor, and, if needed, blood. The evolution of symbolic thought only deepened the power of conflict. With the blossoming of language, humans learned to organize not just physical weapons, but psychological ones as well. Songs of triumph, stories of villainy, symbols daubed in paint or carved into bone that marked the boundaries of belonging and exclusion. The very first totems and amulets, perhaps, were claimed as much for spiritual protection as for the terror they might inspire in enemies. Despite this, life was not an endless march of blood and vengeance. Survival required a delicate balance. Tribes that were too aggressive risked annihilation, whether from external foes or from fraying bonds within. Those too passive might be exploited and erased. Thus, over generations, bands developed intricate rules for conflict and conciliation. Reconciliation rituals, gift exchanges, and complex forms of hospitality that allowed even bitter rivals to meet, speak, and for a moment, lay down their arms. Still, the memory of violence colored these rituals. Hospitality was sacred precisely because the stakes were so high-breaking the peace could mean total war. Alliances formed through marriage were doubly binding, mixing bloodlines to prevent future wars. Even the telling of ancient stories around the fire became a tool for remembering the cost of forgetting peace. In this crucible, the human mind grew sharper, more imaginative, and ever watchful. The awareness that others might covet what you have, or fear what you might do, birthed not only caution, but the first sparks of strategy. Bands sent out scouts to watch for strangers and devised signals to alert the camp of danger. Children learned not just who to trust, but the signs of an imminent attack, a distant cry, a sudden silence among the animals, a scent on the wind. The migration of early humans across continents brought new waves of both hope and crisis. Crossing mountains, rivers, and deserts, families seeking new lands sometimes encountered others with similar dreams. Some meetings were peaceful, others fatal. In the absence of permanent cities or fortified villages, the movement of groups across hostile landscapes was always fraught with risk. Yet, the same curiosity that drove violence also made humanity endlessly adaptable. Individuals who learned to read the intentions of others, who bridged gaps with language, gesture, or gift, often survived where pure force failed. Out of necessity, early diplomacy was born. Not in council halls or embassies, but on the edges of forests and by the banks of ancient streams, where two groups waited for a sign, approach or flee. Archaeologists still sometimes unearth the silent witnesses to those ancient negotiations, two distinct tool traditions blended in the same buried camp, fragments of shared ornaments, or the skeletons of men, women, and children whose lives ended not in battle, but side by side, marked by ritual and cooperation. But for every patch of peace, the threat of war never wholly disappeared. Sometimes, the stakes were too high, or the misunderstandings too deep. In those moments, the old patterns reasserted themselves, blade against bone, strategy against strength, the fate of the tribe hanging in the balance. The world was changing. The last ice age would soon end, and new revolutions loomed on the horizon. The era of small, mobile bands would give way to larger, more permanent settlements. But in this twilight of deep prehistory, the double-edged legacy of humanity was already set. We are creatures of both the campfire and the spear, ever searching for home, ever wary of the unknown. How our ancestors navigated this world, choosing when to fight and when to parley, when to trust and when to fear, would lay the unshakable foundations on which all future societies and all future wars would be built. The gathering tide, settlement, surplus, and the first organized warfare. With the end of the long glacial epoch and the dawn of the Holocene, the world humans inhabited changed as dramatically as the sky after a storm. Great ice sheets retreated, the land blossomed, and bands of people began to settle in places where the earth was generous. By rivers, lakes, or coastal plains where game was plentiful, soil fertile, and life, for the first time, grew more predictable. This new experience of abundance brought both promise and peril. As the world became more bountiful, it also became more coveted. And so the next chapter of human conflict began, not just struggles between mobile bands, but disputes between settlements that would eventually lay the groundwork for all organized warfare to come. The earliest villages were patchworks of huts or tents clustered around water, nestled in valleys, or raised above floodplains. Their centers were lively places of cooperation and mutual aid. Yet, as the population densities grew, so too did anxieties previously unknown. For the first time, groups could accumulate a surplus harvested grain, dried meat, stored seeds, resources not meant for immediate consumption, but set aside for harder seasons. This surplus promised security, but it also enticed outsiders. Food could now be stolen, not merely for survival in the moment, but out of envy, ambition, or calculation for the future. Archaeological records show traces of violence shadowing the rise of these early settlements. Defensive structures appear: earthen walls, wooden palisades, stone enclosures. These are testaments to both collaborative building and collective mistrust. Those who lived on the edge between plenty and want learned to arm themselves, standing guard against the dark, sharpening wooden stakes, hunched over the embankment, eyes scanning the night for torchlight or the sound of stealthy feet in grass. The birth of agriculture was humanity's second great revolution after the discovery of fire and language. Farming demanded an unprecedented investment of labor clearing fields, sowing, tending, harvesting. Now the land itself became precious. It was no longer enough to merely travel to a new place when resources ran dry. For the first time, the defense of territory took on a different meaning, not just for hunting or seasonal foraging, but as an enduring claim, a legacy that could be inherited. Land became not just the stage for life, but the very substance of wealth and identity. Villages flourished and mingled, growing into towns. Families became clans, clans intertwined into tribes and chiefdoms. Alliances were built through arranged marriages, trading pacts, mutual defense against marauders. But peace, as ever, was delicate and fleeting. Where boundaries blurred or overlapped, where one group's irrigation ditch encroached on another's grazing ground, or where the march of fence posts seemed two bold old fears ignited into new kinds of violence. No longer isolated reprisals or vendettas, but battles planned with purpose, leaders at the front, and warriors armed with improved weapons. The weapons of this age were more deadly, reflecting greater craftsmanship and innovation. Stone axes and flint-tipped arrows appeared, then the first crude copper blades and ornaments of status. These technological advances affected not only hunting, but the art of war. Warriors distinguished themselves with new rituals, painting their faces before battle, wearing necklaces of animal teeth or shell. Songs were sung before fighting. Drums beat rhythms that echoed in the hearts of those preparing for glory or death. It was in this meeting of surplus and scarcity, neighbor and stranger, that the psychological landscape of organized warfare emerged. To provide and protect became the highest virtues. The concept of defending us one's village, field, or sacred burial ground, became a rallying cry. The cost of defeat was not merely the loss of property, but the risk of total ruin. Crops burned, granaries looted, captives taken, and occasionally the invaders laying claim not merely to territory, but to the vanquished themselves. Evidence from Neolithic graveyards tells the story plainly. Mass burials of men, women, and children killed at once. Skeletons marked by club or arrow wounds, sometimes hurriedly interred alongside their kin. Other sites show fortifications hastily rebuilt after raids or redoubled in anticipation of renewed threats. The struggle for supremacy was no longer just a matter of strength or cunning. It was now about endurance, planning, and the ability to create and maintain strong defenses. With the accumulation of wealth came new social distinctions. Chiefs emerged, sometimes elected, sometimes born to their station, often both war leader and high priest. The chief's house stood taller, the storage bins larger, the symbols of authority more elaborate. The capacity to lead warriors, to gather and distribute food, to negotiate with rival chiefdoms, or intimidate would-be attackers, became the mark of greatness. The seeds of formal hierarchies, nascent states, and eventually nations were planted in these days. The stakes kept growing. Raiding became an art as much as a necessity. Skirmishes were planned around the cycles of planting and harvest, when a rival was vulnerable or fields were ripe for theft or destruction. Bands of warriors would slip through the night, strike at dawn, and vanish with livestock, grain, or captives, leaving enemies scrambling to retaliate or sue for a fragile peace. Sometimes conflict escalated into all-out war, a concerted effort not just to steal, but to conquer or annihilate another community. At the same time, the mechanisms for peace became more sophisticated. Formal negotiations were marked by feasts and exchanges of gifts or hostages. Oaths were sworn on sacred objects, and the breaking of an oath brought shame and retribution not just upon an individual, but upon an entire lineage. Early forms of law rules regulating blood price, compensation for injury, penalties for theft emerged as tools for dampening the endless cycle of revenge. The spiritual landscape shifted as well. Gods and spirits overseeing fields, weather and fortune became gods of war and peace, called upon before battle, placated after death. Soldiers sometimes took charms or amulets into battle. Priests or shamans may have prophesied the outcome of a raid. Burial rites reflected the new reality. Fallen warriors interred with their weapons, sometimes with tokens from faraway lands. Evidence of conquest or distant trade, victory or sorrow. All these things, the rise of leaders, the stockpiling of surplus, the building of towns and earthworks, the invention of law and new gods, refined both the means and meanings of war. Conflict was no longer the exception, but an expected part of the world. The young were taught to be suspicious, to guard the granary in the spring, to stand ready to take up arms when the announcement of an enemy's arrival swept across the village. The old, in their memories and stories, kept alive both the glories and horrors of battles past, binding the tribe in remembrance, warning, and resolve. Yet, at every moment, humankind also practiced the arts of conciliation. No society could exist in perpetual war. The rhythm of conflict alternated with periods of peace, and the most successful communities were those who learned to balance war with wisdom. Elders and diplomats journeyed between settlements bearing tokens and earnest words, seeking to avert disaster before it erupted. Marriages united enemy clans, trade brought former rivals to a shared table, and feasting forged bonds that sometimes outlasted the memories of bloodshed. In this balance, a world grown too crowded for escape, too rich for indifference, war became at once more dangerous and more organized, yet peace more necessary and more creative. From these crucibles arose the patterns that would outlast the Stone Age, shaping the destiny of kingdoms and empires yet unborn. The battlefields of the ancient world were not so numerous as in later centuries, but they were no less formative. Each conflict etched a deeper groove in the human story, one we still follow today, whether in enmity, caution, or hope. Bronze and Blood, the rise of warriors and the age of fortresses. As centuries slipped by, villages became towns, and towns grew into the first ancient cities. These burgeoning settlements, Uruk, Jericho, Mohenjo-daro, and others, rose above river valleys, gleaming with the promise of organization, security, and abundance. But with population growth and agricultural wealth came ever sharper competition. The appearance of metal, first in the form of soft copper, then the transformative innovation of bronze, ushered in a new chapter of conflict and defense, a chapter defined by power, strategy, hierarchy, and the relentless will to conquer or survive. Metal changed everything. A copper axe or bronze blade, harder and sharper than stone, could slice through rough leather, wood, and bone with terrifying efficiency. The warrior who carried a bronze-tipped spear was not just a hunter or a farmer, but a new kind of specialist, a professional of violence, trained not only to defend his home, but to press outward, seeking glory or plunder beyond distant horizons. Communities that once scavenged for stones now dug deep into the earth for tin and copper. Mines, workshops, and casting pits became as important as fields, turning blacksmiths into figures of secret knowledge and guarded skill. With metal's arrival, the arms race between towns quickened. As tools evolved, so did armor. The first helmets and breastplates appeared, crafted from hammered bronze or leather, toughened by boiling in oil. Warriors marched beneath banners, symbols of allegiance fluttering in the dusty wind. But weapons were only a part of the revolution. Societies themselves began to change. Kings, once merely the first among equals, declared themselves gods or the sons of gods. They gathered close councils of trusted warriors, priests, scribes, and artisans. With these new centers of power came laws, taxes, and armies. Military service became an obligation, a rite of passage, or even sometimes a source of escape for the lowliest peasant or slave daring to become a soldier. On the wide plains of Anatolia, in the sweltering valleys of Egypt, and atop the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, fortresses rose higher every year, ringed by walls that spoke of ambition as much as of fear. Defensive architecture grew ever more ingenious, moats, earthworks, bastions, and hidden gates. The city itself became both a weapon and a prize. It was now not enough to simply survive. Existence demanded organization and foresight. Towns trained standing guards, formed militias, and more, relied on a class of full-time soldiers. In the shadow of looming walls, the ordinary person's life was marked by cycles of tension work in the fields, interrupted by relentless drills, alarms at midnight, the ever-present risk that a distant feud or jealousy could bring war to the gates at any moment. When war came, it was thunderous and terrible. Processions of men arrayed in gleaming metal, pounding drums and shrill horns, all converged on a chosen field or battered at city walls. Archers loosed volleys that darkened the sun. Engineers pushed towers, hurled stones, and rammed gates with logs tipped in metal. The city defenders hurled back rocks and pots of burning oil, showering attackers with arrows and jeers. If the walls fell, chaos ensued. Homes were looted, temples defiled, men killed or enslaved, women and children sold or carried off as prizes. Sometimes, a captured city was wiped from the earth, its ruins left as a warning for centuries. Yet for every siege that ended in fire and death, there were truces, treaties, and ransoms, as rulers realized that mutual exhaustion could bring about fleeting peace. Ambassadors risked passage between rival cities, carrying precious gifts and secret bargains. Marriages united dynasties long at odds. Written language, once a priestly monopoly, now echoed the needs and dramas of the battlefield. Records of tribute, threats, spy reports, and tallies of the fallen. New kinds of leaders rose from the crucible. In some lands, the greatest warriors' champions celebrated in story and legend became kings themselves or advisors to monarchs. They attracted followings of loyal fighters, bound not by kinship, but by oaths of brotherhood and visions of shared spoils. These warlords could tip the scales in dynastic struggles, or even found their own short-lived kingdoms carved from the lands they conquered. Religion and war continued their uneasy embrace. Armies marched under the gaze of patron gods, each battle sanctified with rituals and sacrifices. Priests read omens, seeking signs in the entrails of animals or patterns in the stars. Warriors prayed for victory or for strength in death, tying tokens to weapons or painting the faces of the slain with the colors of the afterlife. Victors sometimes gave thanks by erecting temples. The defeated, if spared, left offerings in the hope of forgiveness or revenge. For the ordinary peasant, war meant uncertainty and suffering. A future upended overnight, neighbors turned into refugees, crops trampled, labor stolen for grand construction projects or foreign campaigns. The price of ambition was paid most dearly by those with the least to lose. But the city-dwelling elite began to see war as a means of accumulating wealth, status, and security. Spoils of war cattle, metals, slaves, sacred statues, funded public works, built palaces, and fed the dreams of empires. Within the city walls, the arts of peace and war converged. The same bronze that armed the soldier also adorned the altar, the temple, or the king's throne. Storytellers elevated the deeds of generals. Artists carved monuments depicting victories, both real and imagined. Schoolchildren learned to copy epic poems that mingled divine wrath and human glory. The line between history and rumor, fact and legend, began to blur. Yet, as cities and armies grew, so did the possible scale of disaster. Plague and famine often followed in the wake of wars, spread by refugees or by the blackened fields left behind retreating armies. Even the greatest fortresses could fall, not to swords or arrows, but to hunger, thirst, or betrayal from within. Commanders became masters not just of weapons, but of logistics, engineering, espionage, and psychological warfare. By the end of the Bronze Age, the world was a checkerboard of alliances, feuds, and shifting interests. Information, for the first time, became almost as valuable as materials. The fate of a city or empire might turn on a whispered secret or a timely betrayal. The ancient Near East had become a laboratory for every conceivable tactic of war and peace, from bloody conquest to complex, fragile treaties and back again. In this volatile crucible, the traditions of individual heroism remained, but the age of the lone champion was waning. Instead, the power of a leader was measured by his ability to command, to inspire obedience, to assemble and control diverse peoples and technologies. The art of governing and the art of war became inseparable. The Bronze Age was not the end of conflict, but merely a new stage, a time when war, for better or worse, became one of the defining features of civilization, and a force that would shape human destiny for thousands of years to come. The clang of metal, the rattle of chariots, the echo of walls crumbling in flame, these became the pulse of history, setting the stage for new empires, even greater ambitions, and more terrible reckonings to follow. Iron, empire, and the engines of conquest. The world shifted once again, and the clang of bronze was matched and then overwhelmed by the sharper, colder ring of iron. In valleys and on plains where ancient armies had once paraded brilliant bronze, new shadows fell, those of swords that could cut through armor and spearheads, ready to pierce the strongest shield. Iron was more durable and, crucially, more accessible. And so the tools and weapons of war became no longer the privilege of the few but the inheritance of the many. The Iron Age was a democratization of violence, and as the secrets of smelting spread, the scale and scope of conflict reached new heights. Now, empires took shape not just as a product of leadership or ambition, but as the inevitable outcome of mass mobilization and technological momentum. Old city-states were absorbed by ever-growing kingdoms, which themselves became vassals or enemies of even grander entities: Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, Carthage, and the vast realms of China and India. The story of war became the story of empires, each built atop the aspirations, blood, and ingenuity of millions. It was a time when the identity of a people became intertwined with the concept of the army. Every season, fresh recruits, farmers, shepherds, hunters were drawn into the ranks, drilled to fight in phalanx, cohort, or cavalry charge. Uniformity and discipline replaced the wild individuality of the old champion. The army became a machine. Rows of identical helmets gleamed at the enemy line, shields overlapped in perfect rhythm, and orders barked by centurions or sergeants echoed over hills and valleys. Victory was now often less about personal glory and more about the collective weight of 1,000 spears pressing relentlessly forward. States and warlords invested in roads and supply depots, in training grounds and foundries. Campaigns could stretch for months, even years, supplied by caravans of ox carts bearing grain, wine, and weapons. Victories were not won solely on the battlefield, but planned well in advance by ministers, bureaucrats, and spies. The birth of logistics tables of rations, chain of command, and constant message relays transformed the nature of war from chaos to a science of calculation. Iron and empire also brought new scales of terror. Whole peoples were uprooted and deported as punishment or strategy. Defeated cities saw their walls razed, surviving citizens sold into slavery, their gods paraded through the streets of the victors. The wails of the conquered echoed in distant foreign capitals, reminders both of the might of empires and the fragility of fortune. Yet, in this age of total war, ideas began to travel even faster than iron weapons. Conquering armies brought not only death and subjugation, but also language, scripts, religions, and inventions. Soldiers and merchants, priests and poets crossed seas and deserts, sowing seeds of Greek philosophy in Persian soil, or Chinese bureaucracy on the steppes, or the faiths of Israel and Egypt across the reaches of Rome. The old boundaries faded, the violence that tore down walls also planted unexpected gardens. Warfare became a theater for technological and strategic innovation. Horse archers swept across Asia, chariots thundered down from Anatolia, and phalanxes bristled in Greece. Tactics grew ever more complex. Feigned retreats, ambushes, sieges with catapults and battering rams. Fortifications sprouted towers and double walls. City gates hid cunning death traps. In every encounter, ancient lessons were tested and rewritten. Empires, though vast and mighty, carried in their structure the seeds of future conflict. Authority rested on networks of governors and satraps, each with their ambitions, their rivalries, their secret webs of patronage and resentment. Civil war flared as regularly as war between states, and betrayal was a shadow lurking in every banquet hall. Meanwhile, rebellion kindled among the oppressed. Peasants in far-flung provinces, barred from the spoils of conquest, risked all in uprisings that sometimes shook the world. Not everything was conquest and carnage. In the shadow of empires, periods of relative peace Pax Romana, Pax Sinica let cultures flourish. Roads and aqueducts, libraries and great temples arose, filled with learning and artistry. Trade routes stitched together distant lands, and with every merchant caravan there traveled rumors, recipes, inventions, and even new ways to wage or avert war. And even as new religions rose, preaching compassion, peace, and the hope of a world beyond swords and empires, their followers could not escape the gravity of violence. Faith became both a solace and a weapon, rallying armies beneath sacred banners. Priests and prophets found themselves pressed to bless soldiers, or to decry the cruelty of the powerful, sometimes risking their lives for the sake of peace. The individual, meanwhile, was not lost in the march of empires. Soldiers wrote letters home, poets lamented the suffering of war, and mothers sent their sons to the barracks with both pride and dread. The stones of every surviving fortress and ruined city entombed tales of love and devastation, longing and resilience. The Iron Age was not the end of war, nor its perfection. Only a new scale, a new rhythm. The cries of the dying on the battlefield, the cheers of the triumphant in victory processions, the quiet weeping in conquered streets, all now mingled in a world so much larger, more brutal, and paradoxically, more connected than ever before. Empire, once dreamed of as the road to eternal security, instead became the crucible of new ambitions and new forms of war, yet undreamed. Faith, fury, and revolution. War in the age of belief. As the ancient empires rose and fell, new forces began to shape the heart of human conflict forces, not only of weapons and kings, but of belief itself. The birth and spread of great religions, the dreams of prophets and philosophers, and the cries for justice and change stirred the world in new ways. In this age of faith and revolution, war transformed again, becoming at times a crucible for ideas, and at other times a storm driven by dreams and destruction on an epic scale. It began with whispers, rumors of new truths, tales of messiahs and saviors, warnings from the heavens. Across vast empires, small bands of followers gathered in secret, carrying sacred texts hidden in bundles or written on their hearts. These new faiths promised more than survival. They offered meaning, equality in the eyes of the divine, a hope that transcended the iron tyranny of kings and the grinding weight of poverty. When these beliefs collided with the might of the state or the traditions of old, conflict was often inevitable. Religious wars swept the globe from the deserts where Islam blazed forth to the turbulent lands of early Christianity, to the holy wars and crusades that set continents alight. The banners of the faithful rose against the walls of ancient cities. Armies marched not just for land or gold, but to defend or expand the boundaries of the sacred. Warriors knelt in prayer before riding to battle, convinced their swords were guided by higher powers. Priests and preachers became generals, and sometimes generals claimed the robes of prophets. In the silence before a siege, prayers mingled with the sharpening of blades. Defenders clung to relics and icons, hoping for miracles, while the armies outside invoked oaths and curses, believing themselves destined for glory or martyrdom. The fervor of faith could bind together a fractured people or hurl neighbors into merciless violence. Mercy and cruelty, bravery and fanaticism, each was shaded by the conviction that destiny or salvation lay on the battlefield. The age of belief also brought new forms of law and order. Holy texts became codes of justice. Rulers styled themselves as the protectors, or chosen instruments of the gods. Out of this union emerged new states, caliphates, and Christian kingdoms, empires divided and united by faith. Laws against heresy, blasphemy, and treason became weapons as deadly as the sword, and religious courts judged the fates of the accused. But even as faith granted rulers new power, it also inspired resistance and revolt. Oppressed peoples dreamed of liberation in the names of their gods, or sought justice in the subversive words of prophets. Amid the cities and kingdoms, revolution smoldered. The rule of kings grew heavy. The inequality between noble and peasant festered like an old wound. Philosophers and thinkers, from Greek city-states to Chinese courts, studied war and politics, dreaming of better rulers and juster systems. Eventually, gut-wrenching revolutions shook the order of the world. Slaves revolted in Rome, peasants in Germany rose in desperation, and in distant lands, new worldviews took root, sparking uprisings, hope, and chaos. As gunpowder began to drift over the Silk Road and the first muskets flashed on distant battlefields, war changed yet again. It became louder and crueler, yet also in some ways more democratic. The roar of cannons could topple castle walls once thought invincible. Peasant armies could now challenge knights and warlords. In the cities, the scribes of revolution poets, pamphleteers, and philosophers began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the sword could make a new world instead of only enforcing the old. Conflicts grew ever more complex. The lines between faith, politics, economics, and justice tangled into knots that could not be easily undone. Civil wars split families in two. Neighbors turned betrayer or martyr. And sometimes the dream of a freer, fairer world was lost in a blaze of ambition, vengeance, and blood. Yet, shimmering behind all the fury and loss, hope stubbornly survived. Each catastrophe forced new questions. What is worth dying for? What does it mean to be just? Can swords truly make saints, or just more graves? Out of the ashes of holy wars and revolutions, people built new societies and recommitted themselves, for a time, to ideals of peace, tolerance, and human dignity. The age of faith-driven conflict and revolution redrew maps and remade destinies. It left cities in ruins, but also built new nations upon foundations of law and belief. The dreams and nightmares of this epoch would haunt the centuries to come, whispering warnings and promises to every generation that followed. And in every battle, under the banners of gods or people, humans learned anew that the greatest victories and the most enduring wounds are carried not just by territory gained or lost, but by the conscience of a world always striving to reconcile violence with vision, industry, ideology, and the total war machine. The modern world arrived not with the slow tides of tradition, but on a flood of inventions, revolutions, and ideas that moved with unprecedented speed. Cities sprawled and populations exploded as railways, factories, and steamships shrank continents and pulled the farthest corners of the globe into uneasy contact. The ancient art of war, once determined by courage, faith, or cunning, met the churning engines and restless ambition of industry. The results were both astonishing and terrifying. With the birth of the industrial age, the scale of war was utterly transformed. No longer did conflict depend only on the number of men or horses a nation could muster, but on coal, steel, oil, and the relentless rhythm of assembly lines. Guns and cannons multiplied, no longer crafted one by one, but poured forth by machines in their thousands. Rival factories became as crucial as rival armies. Uniformed ranks drilled with terrifying precision. Their rifles fired in thunderous volleys. War had become a science, and its destruction grew vast beyond imagining. Nationalism and ideology gave these new machines of war a contagious, feverish energy. Flags and anthems ignited the hearts of millions. Everywhere, people heard that they belonged to something larger than themselves, something worth fighting and dying for. Newspapers and telegraphs carried rumors and calls to arms swiftly, turning distant quarrels into matters of national pride or existential threat. The world shrank, and with it, the distance from peace to chaos vanished. The new wars tore across continents, leaving whole landscapes forever changed. The fields of Europe were churned into seas of mud by trenches and shellfire. In Asia, Africa, and beyond, colonial ambition and resistance redrew maps and fueled endless struggle. In cities, families huddled in basements as bombs fell from unseen foes above. In the countryside, refugees streamed along battered roads, carrying the fragments of shattered lives. Technology brought new horrors and new dreams. Railways carried entire armies to the front in days, while telegraphs turned distant generals into near-omniscient orchestrators of slaughter. Ships bristling with iron and steel clashed on stormy seas. Airplanes, miraculous to the last generation, rained death from above. Science and suffering moved hand in hand. The same innovations that promised health and prosperity also powered poison gas, machine guns, and, finally, weapons capable of ending civilization itself. Yet, amid the mechanized carnage, glimpses of courage, mercy, and resistance shone through. Nurses braved the fire-swept battlefields to tend the wounded. Underground movements plotted escape and defiance against occupying armies. Artists, poets, and mourners gave voice to a grief deeper than words, while visionaries and leaders struggled to imagine new paths to peace. Nations convulsed as revolution and counter-revolution swept from factories to palaces, from the cities to the fields. The victors of the world wars traded uneasy truces for new rivalries and alliances, dividing up the spoils and anxiously policing the borders of an anxious world. The Cold War brought its own kind of terror, a peace balanced on the razor's edge of mutually assured destruction. Bombers and rockets waited in underground silos, silent threats shadowing the dreams of entire populations. Yet it was not only weapons that shaped the new age, but ideas: democracy, communism, fascism, nationalism, each carving deep divides in the fabric of humanity. Even as the wars became colder or more covert, humanity searched for hope. Movements for civil rights and independence swept across continents, casting off colonial chains and challenging ancient prejudices. People stood unarmed before tanks, met bullets with bravery and songs, and demanded recognition not as pawns, but as people. Global institutions were born, treaties signed, and, however imperfectly, new visions of collective security struggled to take root in the scorched soil of the 20th century. The engines of war rolled on, but so too did the engines of invention and connection. Satellite signals circled the Earth, carrying news and voices across borders. Trade and cooperation rebuilt broken cities and turned former enemies into partners. And in countless acts of everyday grace, families reunited, strangers helping strangers, voices raised for peace. The scars of modern conflict slowly, painstakingly began to heal. Yet always beneath the surface, tension remained. The lessons of industry and ideology ensured that no future war would ever be small or contained. But the same world that learned to destroy itself also learned to hope for understanding, for reconciliation, for the fragile miracle of peace itself. The age of information, wars of shadows and signals. The last decades of the 20th century ushered in a revolution as total and transformative as the coming of bronze or the rising of great empires. The world had already reeled from two great wars, from the rise and collapse of colonial titans, and from the forging of nuclear weapons with the potential to erase humanity in a single flash. Yet, as satellites circled overhead and computers began their quiet calculations, a new force was gathering strength, one that would recast the nature of conflict, power, and even the meaning of truth. Gone were the days when war was defined solely by armies meeting on a battlefield or by fleets contesting dominion over open waters. In the age of information, struggle took new and elusive forms. The battleground was not always a patch of earth or a stretch of ocean, but the invisible currents of data, the collective imagination of billions, the hopes and anxieties amplified by glowing screens. Word, image, and rumor grew as potent as tanks and jets, and in the shadows of cyberspace, a single line of code could topple entire systems or ignite chaos across continents. From the very first, leaders saw the potential and peril of these new tools. Governments and companies raced to wire the world, telegraph cables, then radio masts, then transoceanic fiber optic lines, each step drawing east to west, north to south, until every point on Earth pulsed with information, never at rest. News that once took weeks or months to travel from conflict zones reached the world in seconds. The sight of a single protest on television, a desperate plea broadcast by satellite, or a whispered rumor gone viral could ripple outward, bringing revolution or panic with breathtaking speed. This new immediacy brought the sufferings and struggles of war into the living rooms and hands of ordinary people everywhere. No longer could leaders hide atrocities deep within remote valleys or distant deserts. Satellite imagery, digital cameras, and daring journalists laid bare the cost of conflict, shattered towns, weeping families, the haunted eyes of refugees. On social media, the victims and the bystanders, the soldiers and the protesters, all spoke for themselves. The world's pain became communal, and so did its hope. Solidarity grew across borders in ways never imagined by generals of old. Yet, for all its promise, the information age turned out to be a double-edged sword. New forms of manipulation and deceit flourished alongside new transparency. In the war for hearts and minds, Armies of propagandists, trolls, and hackers deployed lies and half-truths as easily as bullets. Deepfakes blurred the line between fiction and fact, while state-backed campaigns twisted narratives, sowing division or confusion across friendly and enemy populations alike. Even the best intentions could be reworked or weaponized in the cacophony of the digital bazaar. The battlefield now included the mind, and the old dictum that truth is the first casualty of war had never been more apt. In these invisible theaters of war, the concept of front lines all but vanished. Conflicts no longer needed to be declared in thunderous speeches. They might begin with a sudden plunge in a stock market, the coordinated blackout of power across a hostile capital, or a mysterious virus crippling government computers. Intelligence agencies, once the province of trench-coated spies and secret codes, now recruited mathematicians, linguists, and teens in hoodies, their keyboards as deadly as any arsenal. Nations boasted of their cyber capabilities, launching what many called the world's first truly global arms race in the dark corridors of the Internet. Traditional warfare persisted, of course, bullet and shrapnel never fully replaced by bytes and signals. But it grew more entwined with digital realities at every turn. In the Middle East and beyond, drones circled unseen, delivering sudden death thousands of miles from their operators. Command centers on one continent directed robotic attacks on another. Face-to-face battle rendered almost obsolete by whirring, silent machines. Satellite intelligence meant no army could fully vanish. Every movement left an electronic trace, and every trace became a fresh target. Terrorism, once the weapon of desperate bands with little more than ideology and courage, blossomed in the cracks of this connected world. Extremist groups used encrypted chat apps and online videos to recruit, to threaten, and to educate their followers in the black arts of urban warfare. Lone wolves, radicalized in bedroom forums, emerging with terrifying suddenness to strike at the heart of cities where peace was taken for granted. Networks of violence and fear coexisted with networks of care and hope, the same digital arteries pulsing with wedding invitations and viral protests, with calls for help and for destruction. The wars of the information age did not always kill with bullets and bombs. In the financial markets, a single signal of instability, an intentional rumor, a doctored news clip, could erase fortunes, bankrupt companies, even tip governments off balance. Economic warfare, a concept as old as siege and blockade, saw its potential multiplied 1,000-fold. A line in the code could trigger embargoes, crash banking systems, starve economies without ever launching a missile. Sanctions, tariffs, and the manipulation of global supply chains became levers of power rivaling any standing army. Public opinion itself became the high ground, coveted and constantly contested. In the old world, rulers sent out decrees and waged campaigns of propaganda with bulky pamphlets and posters. In the new, every phone and screen was a target and a weapon both. Memes, hashtags, and viral trends could decide elections, spark uprisings, or crush dissent. Often in waves that crested and broke too quickly for even the most vigilant authorities to contain. The war for reality, for what people saw, believed, and remembered, raged ceaselessly. Sometimes, only in retrospect, did the world grasp that a battle had been fought at all. In this environment, new kinds of soldiers and heroes appeared. Whistleblowers revealed secrets that shook governments to their core, risking exile or prison for the sake of what they called the truth. Investigative journalists, bloggers, and independent observers shone flashlights into the dark corners of war, often at great personal risk. Humanitarian hackers and online activists tried to right wrongs, to slow the spread of violence or counter the storms of misinformation, even as they faced their own doubts and threatened reprisals. Global visibility also forced new accountability. The crimes of war and the blights of corruption had long been shielded by distance and silence. Now, grainy videos and voice messages could spark outrage continents away, and popular pressure sometimes forced the powerful to answer for their deeds. New tools, from live streaming to satellite monitoring of human rights abuses, gave hope to the powerless and new headaches to tyrants who found their deeds a click away from global shame. But these same tools might also stoke the flames. The very interconnectedness that allowed for worldwide protest and solidarity could become a snare. Campaigns to raise awareness of one injustice might drown out news of another. The speed of response enabled wild and sometimes dangerous swings from anger to hope, from confusion to fanaticism. The echo chambers of online culture, built by algorithms, meant that people sometimes saw only what confirmed their fears or rage. Fake news became a force, a strategy, even a weapon in the arsenals of major powers and small groups alike. Conflicts, once thought local, now regularly burst onto the world stage. An uprising filmed on a smartphone in Cairo or Hong Kong could inspire imitations thousands of miles away. The Arab Spring, a wave of revolutions and protests ignited by a single act, a single video, showed that the voice of the street could shake the most entrenched elites, though not always for the better. In turn, states learned to shut down internet service, to track, intercept, and sometimes brutally suppress what they labeled as disinformation, dissent, or treason. The development of artificial intelligence and automated propaganda added yet another twist. Bots and digital agents churned out persuasive or poisonous messages without rest. Fake personalities debated with real ones. Deep learning systems could mimic voices and faces, blurring accountability, making confession or denial a matter of technological arms race. Traditional armies and alliances still mattered, but everywhere they performed their age-old functions in the shadow of networks and screens. Many wars became hybrid conflicts, blending physical violence with information operations, cyber attacks, and economic disruption. Soldiers in camouflage were joined by legions of analysts, hackers, and digital strategists, all vying for the upper hand from windowless operations centers buried in sleepy suburbs or remote data bunkers. The borders of the information war often blended with the borders of everyday life. Home appliances connected to the internet could be turned into cyber attack platforms. Children's games were at times infiltrated by spies and propagandists. In a world where everything and everyone was a node in a shifting web, privacy, once the shield of the home, became a contested and precious luxury. Yet this new world was not defined only by fear. The very openness of the information age engendered empathy, solidarity, and action on a scale previously unimagined. When disaster struck, armies of volunteers appeared online, mapping collapsed neighborhoods, organizing relief, and amplifying the calls for medical help or evacuation. Nonviolent resistance thrived wherever people could coordinate and communicate. Flash mobs, mass demonstrations, virtual sit-ins. Conflicts which once would have ended in massacre or silence were, sometimes, diffused by the glare of publicity, the sunlight of countless digital witnesses. Peace itself took on new meanings. Treaties were sometimes negotiated not only by diplomats, but under the scrutiny, often the pressure of viral campaigns and global audiences. War crimes and humanitarian catastrophes, if not always prevented, became harder to bury. The line between states at war and societies at odds was blurred, as both cooperation and conflict traveled at the speed of light. Children growing up in the information age learned early that the world was dangerously complex and endlessly connected. They saw distant wars and disasters live, learned to spot a bot from a troll, and sometimes found themselves the targets of campaigns from other countries or ideologies. Education became itself a front line to teach discernment, historical memory, and humanity in the face of a swirling storm of opinions and half-truths. All the while, the ancient questions persisted, questions that had haunted every age of war. What is just? What is true? How can peace be kept? And what costs are too great to bear? Only now, these questions reach the ears and eyes of every individual, as information, like water, seeped into every crevice of daily life. The future of war, in the age of information, remained uncertain, terrifying, and hopeful all at once. It seemed that technology would allow both for ever more subtle and devastating conflict, and for unparalleled resistance, creativity, and connection. The greatest victory, perhaps, would be to discern clearly in the fog, to remain vigilant and compassionate even as signals clashed and truths collided. And so, as the world spun into the third millennium, the fate of peace and war rested not only with those who commanded armies or built the next generation of machines, but with all those who watched, listened, questioned, and spoke, each one a soldier, witness, and builder, in the ceaseless struggle to humanize a world ever more united and ever more divided by the invisible web of information. War at the threshold, the age of uncertainty and the human challenge. The world had spun through voices and signals, through shadows and screens, into the strange dawn of the third millennium. The age of information continued, but beneath the surface murmured the promise and threat of epochal change. With each sunrise, new technologies leapt from the realm of imagination and theory into daily life. Genetic editing, autonomous machines, quantum computers, and artificial intelligence. The old questions of war and peace, of justice and power, remained unresolved, but their forms now blurred, refracted by crises and innovations the ancestors could never have conceived. For many years, the future was spoken of in the language of hope of democracies, connected and wise, of diseases conquered, of hunger banished by automation, of a world where war itself would be outmoded by prosperity and shared understanding. Yet everywhere, new anxieties took root. The same networks that once promised universal connection bred fragmentation, distraction, and distrust. The digital tools that made knowledge accessible to all became vectors for overwhelming misinformation, addiction, and manipulation, at a scale no propagandist of the 20th century could have dreamed. The great global village fractured into a billion walled gardens and echo chambers where reality itself became elastic, and communities, both local and digital, turned inward. War, as it had always done, adapted. In boardrooms and bunkers, at hackathons and secret research labs, the next chapter was being written, sometimes by human hand, sometimes by the code of autonomous agents. Nations and corporations, communities and criminal syndicates, all jockeyed for advantage in a world dancing on the edge of transformation and chaos. Armed conflict in the traditional sense had not disappeared. But even in its bloodiest episodes, the signs of transformation were everywhere. Unmanned drones. Once the exclusive domain of superpowers, became as ubiquitous as rifles in many armed forces. From the high desert plateaus of Central Asia to the shattered outskirts of North African cities, swarms of cheap, semi-autonomous drones operated in coordination. Some controlled from distant command centers, others following algorithmic directives, blurring the line between soldier and machine. Sometimes these skirmishes played out with almost no human in sight. Fleets of drones mapping, analyzing, attacking, and even repairing themselves under the gaze of orbiting satellites. With the rise of machine soldiers and the growing sophistication of artificial intelligence, ancient concerns returned in modern form. Debates raged across universities, parliaments, and think tanks. Could an algorithm understand the rules of war, the principles of proportionality and discrimination? Could a machine judge when to withhold fire to protect bystanders, or recognize when an enemy was really a child startled into the open by fear? Treaties were drafted and contested, ethics committees convened and dissolved, while on the front lines, the cold calculus of machine logic performed operations in milliseconds that once would have taken hours or days. Yet, no boundary technical, ethical, or legal held forever. Shadow armies, criminal organizations, extremist networks, even breakaway corporations, commandeered or built their own fleets of autonomous weapons. Sometimes it was a swarm of quadcopters rigged with explosives. In other cases, hackers repurposed delivery drones, facial recognition systems, or bots designed for search and rescue. The democratization of war's tools, once feared in the age of gunpowder, now returned with a vengeance. Even small groups or individuals could threaten cities or set economies trembling with the right bit of code, a tiny black box device, or a viral meme. The front lines fractured still further. Cyberwar became not just a matter of statecraft, but a daily hazard. Viruses and logic bombs slipped through power grids, hospitals, and financial systems. Sometimes the war was announced with an abrupt stock market crash, or the inexplicable blackout of a metropolis. At other times, signs were subtle. A whisper campaign seeded across networks, the persistent undermining of public trust in elections, a sudden panic over the safety of a vaccine spreading through social feeds. Every system was a potential target, and every citizen a node, sometimes shield, too often collateral, rarely combatant by choice. Against this backdrop, the great challenges of the age, climate change, mass migration, water scarcity, became both causes and theaters of war. Famine, once the byproduct of siege or misrule, surged as drought and degradation swept across the globe. People on the move seeking refuge from war, disaster, or the slow violence of poverty became both symbols of hope and pawns in geopolitical maneuvering. Border conflicts and resource wars erupted, sometimes as simmering low-grade violence, other times with sudden ferocity, as rivers ran dry or coasts vanished beneath rising tides. Armies manned seawalls as often as frontiers, and the fight for habitable land or drinkable water gained a bitter new urgency. Yet, if the dawn of the millennium seemed dark, it also shimmered with possibilities. Networks built to wage invisible war became, in other hands, tools of solidarity, creativity, and resistance. Grassroots movements, once scattered and isolated, found new ways to connect and organize. Environmental activists mapped oil spills by drone. Citizens documented and exposed war crimes with smartphones, making it ever harder for atrocities to vanish into silence. Collective intelligence, the wisdom of vast crowds sharing tiny fragments of knowledge, at times outpaced even the world's most advanced institutions in crisis response and mobilization. But the shadow of control never disappeared. States strove to dominate the digital commons, to surveil and silence dissent with technology as pervasive as air. Social credit systems, biometric tracking, predictive policing tools. Once the stuff of science fiction blurred the lines between protection and oppression. Each promise of security carried seeds of subjugation, and each innovation to free the mind carried risks of new, subtler dominations. Perhaps most profound were the questions of identity and personhood themselves. In a world where minds could be mapped, modeled, and manipulated by AI, and where virtual realities rivaled the physical, conflict over truth and meaning became central. What did it mean to belong to a nation, a community, or to humanity? When loyalties and worldviews could be shifted or fractured by carefully crafted information? What responsibilities fell to the global citizen who could, at a keystroke, reach out to the world or lash out blindly in outrage or despair? Even as high technology reshaped the surface of war, the enduring realities persisted beneath grief and resilience, cruelty and compassion, the longing for justice, and the ache of loss. Now more than ever, veterans returned, carrying not just wounds and memories, but streams of data, videos, and messages from the front, testifying in real time to horrors and small mercies alike. In refugee camps and battered metropolises, families drew on ancient practices, song, story, and shared labor, to knit together meaning even as storms raged and power flickered. The deep wisdoms of culture and kin, sometimes all that stood between survival and despair, persisted under virtual stars. The value of truth, once assumed as the foundation of law and dialogue, was now feverishly contested. Fact-checkers, citizen journalists, and independent arbiters became as essential as medics in times of crisis. Yet their work often seemed Sisyphean. For every error or lie debunked, 1,000 more swirled to fill the void. In the tumult, people learned to doubt both authority and themselves, to question what was seen, heard, and felt. Some withdrew, seeking comfort in small, trusted circles. Others responded with anger or new brands of radicalism, undermining trust even in the ideals of democracy and human rights. What then was the path forward? Some sought strength in old certainties, nationalism, tradition, and the mythic tales of an earlier age. States rose and fell over promises to reassert borders, restore lost glory, or punish the other. At times, these passions spilled into open violence, pogroms, or calculated terror, and old wounds reopened in the name of memory or vengeance. Others turned toward the uncharted: global governance, shared stewardship of commons, radical transparency, and the harnessing of AI for peace rather than domination. Movements for restorative justice expanded as survivors of war-persecuted minorities, child soldiers, the forcibly displaced refused to let hatred dictate the terms of tomorrow. Across continents and cultures, a quiet hope persisted that even on the edge of catastrophe, humanity could reclaim agency and wisdom in ways never before possible. Peace in the 21st century lost any pretense of simplicity. No treaty or armistice could close the circuitry of planetary crises, nor halt the viral spread of fanaticism or folly. Yet, peace survived sometimes as a treaty, more often as an ongoing process. The daily work of dialogue, protest, education, technology, and care. New architectures of security took shape, distributed, participatory, and flexible, recognizing the limits as well as the promise of technology. The stories of this new millennium, as in every era, were stories of contradiction. The same mesh of satellites that pinpointed missile launchers could, in seconds, map malaria outbreaks and save thousands. The same algorithm that targeted dissidents could, in the hands of the oppressed, coordinate hunger strikes and viral campaigns for justice. The world's vast surveillance systems, dreaded by some, delivered evidence of environmental devastation and held polluters to account. Progress reverberated against threat at every level. Individuals, too, found themselves transformed. Children learned digital literacy before they learned to write by hand. Elders, once teachers of the old world, adapted or faced isolation. Careers, families, and lives were made and unmade by digital reputation, by a storm of likes, shares, and digital footprints that never fully faded. The ghostly presence of all this data, eternal yet endlessly shifting, became a new kind of ancestor, storing the private and the public, the triumphant and the tragic alike. The old boundaries between war and peace, civilian and soldier, home and battlefield, blurred to the point of irrelevance. In a digitized world, everyone was a stakeholder, a potential target, a potential hero. No place was wholly safe, but neither was hope ever wholly extinguished. The future depended, as always, on human choices, on the humility to learn, the courage to speak, the discipline to question both the easy comfort of algorithm and the seductive certainty of ideology. From the ruins and wonders of this uncertain age, the human challenge remained clear. Would we become prisoners of our own inventions, cycling endlessly through arms races, digital feuds, and ecological self-destruction? Or would we find new forms of solidarity, resilience, and wisdom that could turn the engines of innovation to deeper purposes? Every war in history, every peace painstakingly built, every lesson nearly forgotten or painfully remembered, now lived side by side, accessible in an instant, to anyone with the will to search. If the past was a series of echoing battles for land, gold, or gods, the contest of the future seemed likely to be for the very soul and sanity of humanity. For truth, for justice, for the fragile, unfinished task of living together on a planet grown both infinitely large and inescapably small. In moments of darkness, the old light appeared, a searchlight tracing peace across the turbulence. A hand reached out in empathy, a hard-won agreement to share, a stubborn insistence that even in the age of uncertainty, hope mattered, and the future remained unwritten. Beyond the horizon, the futures we choose. The human story, told through so many battles, alliances, sorrows, and hopes, has always swayed between shadow and sunlight. As the world stands at the opening of yet another uncertain era, the old certainties fall away, replaced by questions that feel larger than ever before. The dense weave of technology, the intricate knots of global connection, the raw wounds of history, and the awakening promise of new generations all intersect, converging toward a horizon as mysterious as it is vast. In this future, no single destiny is assured. The very idea of war, its meaning, its causes, its weapons, its victors, and its victims, is in flux. Will humanity succumb to its oldest patterns, now amplified by relentless innovation? Or can we write a new script, one of restraint, wisdom, and courage? The seeds of every possibility are already sown in the world of today. The new terrain of conflict. Never before have the stakes been as high or the choices as complex. Even now, in countless laboratories, boardrooms, and quiet home offices, the tools of tomorrow's wars are under construction. Quantum computers crack codes and simulate entire battlefields in streams of probabilities, making traditional secrecy all but obsolete. Artificial intelligence not only monitors threats, but anticipates them, scrutinizing vast rivers of data, searching for patterns invisible to human eyes. Weapons themselves are evolving from simple extensions of the hand to extensions of the mind and will. Swarms of microdrones, some only as large as insects, can infiltrate, surveil, or destroy with chilling precision. New materials, grown molecule by molecule, create armor that adapts in real time, exoskeletons that magnify human strength, and camouflage that folds soldiers into the fabric of their environment. Remote-controlled vehicles land, sea, air, and now space. Redefine where war can be waged, and by whom. The militarization of orbit is no longer science fiction. Satellites and automated outposts crowd the night sky, some carrying the means to blind, disable, or destroy rival satellites in an instant. The race for resources and strategic advantage stretches beyond the planet, threatening to turn the very cradle of life, Earth, into one more contested frontier. And yet, for all its futuristic strangeness, the theater of conflict remains at heart, inescapably human. Battles may be waged by machines, yet the cost is still counted in shattered families, in children's lost years, in communities torn apart. The strange logic of escalation, retaliation, and uncertainty persists, sometimes disguised by the cool rhetoric of technical progress, sometimes inflamed by old hatreds carried into new ages. The fraying edges of world order. In this new era, the threadbare institutions of the previous centuries are tested as never before. Alliances rise and stutter. The great unions and treaties of nations wrangle not only over tariffs and territory, but over the rules of cyberspace, of AI sovereignty, of planetary stewardship. The United Nations and its peer organizations cling to relevance, pushing for new structures, digital charters of human rights, codes of conduct for autonomous weapons, agreements on responsible genetic editing and planetary engineering. At the same time, nimble networks and informal coalitions spring up, determined to address crises that old empires and new technocracies alike seem unable or unwilling to solve. Border disputes persist, but now many of the lines at stake are invisible. Control of data, ownership of code, authorship of culture, and the meaning of identity itself. Information, both precious and precarious, is traded, hoarded, weaponized, and sometimes deleted forever. Language evolves at dazzling speed. New dialects shaped on social networks overtake old ones. Slang becomes code, and code becomes command. While the old logic of arms races and brinkmanship lingers, a parallel culture of peace labs flourishes. Teams of technologists, diplomats, community leaders, and activists convene across disciplines and continents. Augmented reality simulations help former enemies negotiate by walking through the consequences of violence together. Seeing from the other's eyes, feeling the tangible, if artificial, aftermath of every decision. Some regions, weary of history's burdens, invest more in digital reconciliation, truth commissions streamed live, reparations paid in global currencies, and mutual aid. In all of this, the voice and agency of ordinary people matter as never before. Empowered by technology and coordinated through swarms of social and civic platforms, global citizens intervene in real time, funding refugees, fact-checking rumors, launching boycotts, or organizing ceasefires from the grassroots upward. Hunger for justice and dignity, after centuries of suppression, now finds its outlet in mass mobilization that is at once local and planetary. The burden and promise of memory. As the future unfurls, collective memory becomes both burden and guide. The persistence of digital records means that no atrocity, no heroism, no tragedy or triumph is ever truly lost, except by neglect or willful erasure. Millions of hours of video testimony, billions of photographs, archives of messages, and algorithms that can reconstruct the faces, voices, even emotions of the long dead. All this constitutes the world's new memory palace. Yet memory can accuse as well as inspire. The unhealed wounds of genocide, of colonial conquest, of environmental devastation pulse through the new generations, sometimes birthing movements for repair, sometimes feeding rage and reaction. How to balance remembrance and renewal. How to honor the dead and yet grant the living a future unshackled by revenge. Some communities make radical experiments in forgiveness. Digital truth games, where adversaries speak honestly behind avatars, AI mediators advancing conversation only when empathy is detected. Others turn inward, defending cultural identity through festivals, art, and local histories, preserving the specific against the flattening pressures of globalization. Environmental tipping points and the fight for survival. The future of war and peace is inseparable from the fate of the planet itself. As the century progresses, climate change is not only an abstract threat, but a reality lived daily. Through firestorms, super typhoons, crop failures, heat waves, and dying seas. Wars for water and arable land, for safe refuge and stable supply lines, flare ever more frequently. Some nations adapt, developing cooperative pacts for resource management and climate mitigation. Others harden borders, weaponize migration, and retreat into survivalist isolation. New forms of ecological warfare emerge. Some actors attempt geoengineering seeding clouds, pumping aerosols into the atmosphere, or using targeted genetics to save or sabotage crops. The ethics of these interventions rival their technical difficulty, igniting new debates on planetary boundaries and the rights of future generations. And on the hopeful edge, collaboration sparks innovation. Solar peace corridors, where warring groups agree to maintain solar farms for the benefit of all. Transboundary wildlife, preserves protected by joint patrols of veterans from opposing armies. And cities rebuilt as green enclaves that offer jobs and hope for those displaced by both violence and disaster. The unending struggle with ourselves. Beneath the swirl of innovation and risk, the central tension is unchanged, the struggle with human nature and the imagination of a better world. Each generation must answer, what kind of peace, what kind of society, what kind of future are we willing to fight for? For some, the temptation of control through surveillance, secrecy, and domination remains irresistible. For others, the horizon glows with experiment, openness, and mutual care. Education evolves to meet the new moment, no longer merely the transmission of facts, but training in discernment, kindness, digital self-defense, and the rituals of peace-building. Children and youth are taught to recognize manipulation, to navigate multiple realities, to build coalitions across difference, and to bear witness to both horror and beauty. Elders, two keepers of memory, and mentors for resilience, are called back into central roles. Their wisdom needed more than ever in the storm. Spiritual traditions, old and newly born, re-emerge as refuge from the chaos, reminding humanity of humility, awe, and the dignity of every being. Tech-savvy monks, indigenous healers, secular philosophers, and cyber-spiritual guides all have their followings, nurturing the contemplative spaces where war's utility is most honestly doubted. Choosing our horizon. If the future is contested, it is also uniquely open to choice. Never before has humanity wielded such power to shape destiny, whether toward annihilation or astonishing renewal. The memories of loss are heavy, the tools of violence, sometimes overwhelming. But woven beneath them all is a stubborn will to survive and to transcend, planted anew with every act of kindness, every moment of reflection, every refusal of hate. Perhaps the truest boundary is not the line between peace and war, but the threshold between resignation and imagination. If the horizon is dark, it is not empty. Even at the gates of cataclysm, laughter survives. Even as dystopias tempt with their fatalistic certainty, the quiet work of healing, creating, reconciling, and forgiving continues, often unnoticed, always essential. The story of war, then, is not only a record of ruin, but also a chronicle of resistance. The art that keeps hope alive in bombed-out rooms, the treaties drafted by the traumatized but unbroken, the cities rising on bones and dreams. Our horizon is woven from the choices we make, individually and together, whether to be swayed by fear or to reach toward each other with open hands. So as dawn breaks on yet another century, the question is not just, will there be war? It is, how will we respond? Who do we want to become? What futures are still possible, waiting just beyond the horizon? The page is open. The story goes on.